Hi, everybody. And so today we're going to move on to module three. And for this week, we're going to be considering global climate and its impacts on the functioning of ecosystems around the world. Now, the global climate, just in summary, arises because the sun's rays fall upon the earth and the sun's rays end up heating up the land and the atmosphere and the waters of the ocean, and that heat is moved and it is redistributed around the globe. And is that redistribution is affected by, first of all, by winds, and second of all, by ocean currents. And those two together, the ocean currents and winds, tend to produce relatively stable long-term weather patterns, which we refer to as climate, which are specific for certain areas of the globe. And we're going to see that latitude has a very strong impact on the climate of the different areas of the globe. So before we go any further, let's get some definitions clear in our minds. The difference, for example, between weather and climate. Weather is the state of the atmosphere at a particular time and place, a specific time and place. You look out the window, it's raining, that is the weather for the day. You can think about the previous week. What is the weather been like for the last week? What was the weather like last month, whatever. But what you're talking about in weather is a short time period. Climate is the characteristic weather conditions which prevail predictably for a specific area over a long period of time. Typically, it's averaged 30 years or even more, and that is recognized as characteristic weather patterns over a long period of time. So the reason that this arises at all is because the sun's rays impact on the earth, and they do so because the sun radiates many kinds of radiation, but the ones that we're particularly concerned with are the visible light rays, ultraviolet light, and then infrared radiation. And infrared radiation is in fact heat. When infrared radiation impacts on molecules, it causes them to vibrate, and that we perceive as heat. So when we look at the radiation from the sun, we see that what arrives at our planet, about 43% is visible light, as shown here. About 53% is infrared light, and a very small percentage, about 4%, is ultraviolet light. We're not going to talk about ultraviolet light here, but it is important, but not for the purposes of climate and weather. So these are this 96% here. This is what is particularly important in terms of the global heat budget. So when this infrared radiation arrives at the atmosphere, in fact, a lot of the infrared radiation is immediately reflected back out to space. So the visible light becomes the really important part of this radiation spectrum in terms of heating of the atmosphere and of the planet. But certainly there is some contribution of the infrared itself as well. But a lot of this is, as I say, is reflected back out to space. We can see something simple budget here for radiation arriving at the planet, and we see that about 23% is absorbed by the atmosphere. About 29, nearly a third of the arriving radiation is immediately reflected back out to space, and about 48% is absorbed at the surface of the Earth. So 23% by the atmosphere, 48% by the surface of the Earth. Now when that radiation arrives whether it's in the form of infrared or it's in the form of visible light, and gets absorbed. The surface of the Earth doesn't just keep on heating up and heating up and heating up and heating up. It doesn't continue to accumulate heat. Instead, it radiates a lot of that radiation back out to space, and it radiates it as heat. And that heat is radiated out to the vastness of space, where it is absorbed. Over a very long period of time, the Earth has established a heat budget. And so incoming radiation should be as much as the outgoing radiation. And the thing is that the incoming radiation is in a different form. It's in the form of light and some infrared. The outgoing is all infrared. It's all heat that goes out to space. So here's the reason that this incoming solar radiation results in specific effects on weather and climate, and especially on climate over very, very long periods of time. Because just picture our planet in orbit around the sun. Our planet is in fact at an angle. It is tilted with respect to the sun. So when we look at the arrival of radiation from the sun, we realize that in the equatorial regions here, the sun's rays actually fall on a very narrow area. So these areas are strongly heated, much more strongly than at high latitudes. Now, I need to specify in case you don't know. The equator is a low latitude. It is 0, in fact, the equator. The poles are high latitude. This is 90 degrees latitude north, 90 degrees of latitude south. So when I talk about high latitudes, I'm talking more towards the pole from the equator. In high latitudes, the sun's rays are spread out over a very large area, so they are relatively less heated by the sun's rays than in the equatorial regions where the sun's rays fall directly. Now, that is not the only consideration, of course, because in fact, in high latitudes, the sun's rays spread out over a large area, but they also pass through a lot more atmosphere than in the equatorial regions. So there's a lot more absorption of heat by the atmosphere here, and the terrestrial or ocean in that area in the high latitudes tends to be much less heated than in the equatorial regions. I'll also just point out to you, by the way, have a look, I'll show you a better diagram in a minute, but have a look here where the sun's rays are falling directly. Here in this diagram, the sun's rays are not falling directly on the equator. Here's the equator, 0 degrees. But the sun's rays in this instance are falling directly on a tropic. This is the furthest south that the direct rays of the sun will move in a year. So this is a tropic here, and this is the Tropic of Capricorn in the southern hemisphere. The sun's rays here are falling directly there. This is the southern hemisphere's summer solstice. There's the northern hemisphere's winter solstice. This would be around our Christmas time for us. So we have Christmas time, this time of year, we're enjoying winter, if winter can be enjoyed. Southern hemisphere, that is their summer. This already gives you an idea that there are the different areas, the amount of sun that they're going to receive not only differs by latitude, but it's going to differ by season as well. We'll see that, more of that in a minute. So when we look over a year-long period of time, here's what we were just talking about in our previous slide. here the sun's rays falling directly onto the Tropic of Capricorn. And this is the winter solstice for us, around about December the 21st, most years. Some years there's a day or two difference. But here, this is our winter solstice. Now, consider 6 months later. And 6 months later, the Earth is on the other side of the sun. Here's the importance of our Earth being tilted relative to the sun, because now the sun's rays appear to have moved, and the direct rays of the sun, 6 months after the winter solstice, they are falling directly on the Tropic of Cancer here. This is the Northern Hemisphere's summer, and this, in fact, is the summer solstice. This is Midsummer's Day for the Northern Hemisphere. And the sun's rays are falling directly on the Tropic of Cancer now. And the Northern Hemisphere now is much warmer than the Southern. Winter, the Northern Hemisphere is much cooler than the Southern. So we're going to begin to get the idea that the Earth is being differentially heated. It is being, overall, is being heated more in the tropical areas than it is at the high latitudes. But not only that, we have a seasonal difference, as the Northern Hemisphere tends to be warmer in our summer, and it tends to be cooler when the Southern Hemisphere has their summer. So we've got all of these influences that are producing differential heating patterns around the planet. And those differential heating patterns are heating both the land, the ocean waters, and the atmosphere. And that heat now is going to be redistributed around the planet. And it's going to be redistributed by the movement of air as winds and by the ocean currents. And it's going to be, all of that movement is driven by the sun's energy reaching the surface of our planet. So when we look at the overall heat budgets, what we find is that on average, the equatorial regions tend to gain more heat from the sun's energy than they lose. So they are heated relative to the high latitudes, which tend to lose more heat than they gain from the sun. Now so what is going to happen? Are we just going to carry on heat on and on and on, heating the equatorial region until they get blazing hot and have ice cold poles, which get colder and colder and colder because they are losing heat? No, that is not what happens. Because this heat here, this energy that's coming in from the sun in abundance here is going to be redistributed. And it's going to be redistributed around the planet to warm the higher latitudes and to cool the lower latitudes and maintain the kind of climate patterns that we see in a stable situation. Remember, I'm not going to talk about global climate change. Global climate change results from changes that are occurring in that stable pattern. But under normal circumstances, for the last few tens of thousands of years, we have maintained a relatively stable distribution system where the heat is transported north and south from the equator, from the heated regions, to the cooler regions in the higher latitudes. It has produced relatively stable weather and climate patterns over the surface of the planet. And you'll realize that as I've been talking, here's where the importance of the latitude comes in. Because we see that the lower latitudes are receiving more than the higher latitudes. So it becomes very important for us to observe what latitude we are talking about. The latitude becomes a very important consideration, and that is because of what we said before. The lower latitudes receive direct radiation from the sun, and it passes through only a little bit of a small amount of atmosphere. Higher latitudes, the energy is spread out over a vast area, and in addition, the sun's rays pass through a lot of atmosphere, a lot more atmosphere before they reach the Earth. So the surface of the Earth there loses more than it gains. In the equatorial regions, it gains more than it loses. And in an attempt to balance that out, this heat needs to be redistributed around the surface of the planet. So if we have a look, this is the kind of stable pattern that we see, that the equatorial regions between, here's the equator, here are the tropics, here. This is obviously a distorted view of the planet, but this is our equatorial region here, much warmer than the rest of the planet. Here are the poles, very cold areas of the planet, and in between there is a gradation in heat, and this heat that is gained here is being redistributed to maintain these relatively stable patterns of heat budget, if you want to think about it that way. So let's have a look at how the heat is actually redistributed. And this, we're going to think first that the sun's rays, visible light, and a small amount of infrared light are falling on the surface of the Earth. We think about it doesn't matter really whether you're thinking about land or whether you're thinking about ocean. The same effects arise. The light and infrared is absorbed, and it is as it is absorbed, it is converted to infrared, to heat, and that heat then can heat the air above the lamp. As the heat is radiated out, it heats the air above the lamp. And the initial effect of that is that warm air expands and is less dense than the air around it, and it tends to rise. So if we have an area which is being heated, it tends to heat the air rises up high into the atmosphere. Now there's another effect, and that is that as it goes up, it reaches the upper levels of the atmosphere, it tends to spread out. It diverges, the air diverges. And as it does so, it spreads, it radiates out a lot of its heat to space, and it begins to cool. And when it cools, it will begin to sink again. And let's just think about one thing. If I'm taking air and I'm lifting it up, I'm taking air away from this area here, what is going to happen to the atmospheric pressure here? And the atmospheric pressure is going to drop. And so this would be an area here of low pressure, of low atmospheric pressure. Rising air here moves out, it gets cold, and it sinks to the surface. If I'm bringing air down here, pumping air down here continuously, then what is happening? I'm making this a high atmospheric pressure area. Well, that's not a tenable situation. We can't have the atmosphere building up in pressure in one place and falling in pressure in another place. The air, all this excess air here that's causing the high pressure, is going to have to move to areas of low pressure. It is going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. And we perceive that on the surface of the planet as surface wind. So this system here, this is called a circulation cell. And in fact, we have two circulation cells here. We have warm air rising, diverging here, sinking, and it's causing two circulation cells to arise. And what we have is surface winds here, and high in the atmosphere, we have very powerful, strong winds also blowing. We don't necessarily see that unless sometimes occasionally you have very, very high cloud. You may see that very high cloud moving at a rapid pace. And that is due to these surface winds here. Now, these can be enormous. These circulation cells can be very, very large, as we're going to see in a minute. There is another thing to think about, and that is as this air here rises, it becomes, as it starts to cool, it becomes less and less able to hold on to moisture. Now, the warm air rises, but humid air also rises much more rapidly than dry air, because humid air, air full of water vapor, is less dense than dry air. So we have two effects here. First of all, we're going to take our air, we're going to let it rise. As it rises, it becomes less able to hold on to water vapor. It cools, and the water vapor condenses out as rain. So we have a lot of rainfall in this area here, under this low pressure. That dry air also cools, and this is another contributing factor to make it sink. Cold, dry air sinks, warm, moist air rises. But a lot of that moisture is going to be lost here as rain clouds form, and it falls as rain, maintaining the overall high rainfall here and maintaining a high humidity as well. So when we look at the planet itself, here's our circulation. Here's the circulation cell I was just talking about. And it is a circulation cell that lies around about the equator. Here is the surface air rising here, diverging there, and forming a circulation cell there, and a circulation cell here. And just as I showed you here, with air moving from high pressure to low pressure, from high pressure to low pressure. So here, what we have is an area of low pressure there, a lot of rainfall falling, drier air cooling and sinking here, and a high pressure area here, high pressure area here, and air tends to move from the high pressure to the low pressure. So we have surface winds which are attempting to pass relatively south to north in this cell here, and north to south in this cell here. These are huge circulation cells. They actually, you don't need to remember it, but these circulation cells are called the Hadley cells. And they're the main distributive mechanism to redistribute heat, which is accumulating in the tropical regions, take it and redistribute it, and also lose a lot of it out to space. Because as this air rises, it tends to radiate infrared back out to space. That's one of the reasons it's cooling. So when we establish those ones there, in fact, there are 6 circulation cells altogether around the planet, 3 in each hemisphere, 1, 2, 3. And they tend to work in much the same reason. There's one little difference. This is called the polar cell there. This is the Hadley cell here. And the polar and Hadley cell actually drive this circulation cell, rather like gears spinning, spinning one gear running this way, one gear running that way. It tends to drive this circulation cell here. It doesn't work exactly the same way as these, but nonetheless, These are the 6 circulation cells: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what the effect of those circulation cells is redistribution of atmospheric heat and creation of winds. Now, I said to you that these winds here are tending to move from high latitude to low latitude. Let's just picture what happens. I'm going to ask you to do a thought experiment. What the wind is doing is it's moving from there directly to there, from there directly to there. But we need to remember something, and that is that the Earth is spinning in that direction. It's spinning in that direction. Now, these winds are moving over a vast area, okay? So let's picture the wind. It's moving from there to there. The Earth is turned. It's turned that way. From there to there, the Earth is turned more. From there to there, the Earth is turned more. From there to there, Earth is turned more. If we were to follow a particle of wind trying to move from north to south, we would see that relative to the surface of the Earth, it seems to have moved in this direction. It seems to turn like this. And this ends up producing winds, which tend now, you can see here, which way are these winds blowing? They are blowing northeast. We always name a wind from where it comes, not where it's going. Okay, so it's northeast trades are called the northeast trades because, first of all, they are relatively stable winds. They tend to blow much of the time, and they blow from the northeast towards the southwest in that direction here. And this apparent movement to one side is called the Coriolis effect, named for the person who described it, the Coriolis effect. You will sometimes see it called the Coriolis force, but note that it's not actually a force. There's no force pushing the wind that way. It's simply the wind is moving that way. It has inertia, and the Earth turns underneath it. So it appears that it moves in this direction across. Also notice, pure geometry, that's all it is. If this wind is moving from north to south, and it's tending to be pushed off to the right, if you thought about it that way. Look what happens to the winds that are moving from, we remember we've got a high pressure here, low pressure here, winds tending to move from south to north, and they turn off to the left, like that, for the same reason. They're moving this way, Earth turns, move this way, Earth turns, move this way, Earth turns. And they look like they're blowing this way. So these are called the trade winds for a reason, and that is that they were very reliable winds, and they could be counted on in the days of sailing ships to carry people a long way across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, in this area here, they tend to die out as air is rising and as they're heated and the air rises. This is an area of low pressure and low wind. This area here, if you're interested, is called the doldrums. And if you feel like you're in the doldrums, it's because you're feeling that all the wind has gone out of your sails. So in this area here is also a high pressure area. And so we tend to have winds blowing this way, and we tend to have winds blowing that way. These weather patterns, again, if you look at it, they are occurring over very wide areas, and they are strongly latitudinally influenced. So I've only given you a brief introduction. Please go to these movies. This is your exercise 1, by the way. And so please watch these three. They are short, but they're very explanatory. And it will tell you about the Coriolis effect and everything else and reinforce that. Okay, so that's with a brief introduction into how the air is affected. But the ocean waters are also strongly affected by incoming radiation from the sun. And in fact, in many ways, the ocean heating is by far the most important of the effects of the incoming solar radiation. The reason for that is water takes a very long time to heat up. It needs a lot of energy input into it in order to heat it up, even a small amount. But it also retains that heat for a very long time. So we can heat up water, for example, in the equatorial area, and we can send it off for a very long distance and have it still retain its heat. And I'll point out a couple of effects. The next thing to notice is that, of course, the water is also differentially heated. Water in the low latitudes is heated more than water in the high latitudes. And the water, and we're going to see that the ocean currents actually redistribute heat from the equatorial region to the high latitudes. So they are continually warming the higher latitudes. And these ocean currents have very profound effects on the climate of the areas that they are near to. And the reason for that is, first of all, that they bring warm water nearby, and that warm water radiates heat, but also that radiated heat warms the air above and influences the wind patterns. And so those two things together, the ocean currents and the wind patterns which flow over areas of the earth, those are the things which produce these relatively stable long-term climate patterns for particular areas of the earth. And again, I emphasize, we're going to see that these are strongly latitudinally influenced because the low latitudes receive so much more heat from the sun than the high latitudes. And so I'm not going to do the ocean currents in detail. I have given, if you're interested, I have given you a link to some more information about ocean currents. We're not going to discuss it in any detail. I'm just going to point out a couple of important things to you. First of all, here's the equator here. Warm water is being heated very strongly in the equatorial regions. In addition, there is a tremendous amount of rainfall along the equatorial region, whether we're talking about land or we're talking about the oceans themselves. These bodies of water have over them the air currents that we've described here. So these wind patterns here are tending to drive the surface waters of the oceans in a particular direction. And so, for example, those northeast trades will push water in this direction here. Water tends to accumulate, heat up here in the equatorial region, and then be deflected by the presence of the continents and move around in a great gyre. That is what these are referred to as. These are oceanic gyres. They are moving belts of water, moving ocean currents linked to one another in these great, huge circulations like this. So have a look and realize that what we're seeing here is ocean current, warm ocean current, taking heat from the equator up to the higher latitudes. As it does so, they radiate out their heat warming these areas, but themselves cooling down. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the drivers of ocean currents. We're only going to think for the minute about the surface currents. But here is the great circulation here. Here in the southern hemisphere, here is the other one here. And if we look at the other oceans, here in the Indian Ocean, here is another one here. And here, for our purposes, those of us who are living on the eastern seaboard of the United States, here is one which is tremendously important to us and has a huge influence on our climate all along the eastern seaboard. This current here is called the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream has enormous impact, not only on the eastern seaboard of the United States, but upon Europe as well. The Gulf Stream is one of the reasons that most of Europe, most of the interior of Europe, is relatively warm considering how high its latitude is. If the Gulf Stream was to stop, this whole area here would approach the climate really of the interior of northern Canada, because it's about on the same latitude here. But instead, it has a very much warmer climate, and that is one of the reasons that Europe has had such a high population density for such a very long time, because it has a relatively equitable climate despite its high latitude. I will also just introduce you to the idea that the Gulf Stream appears to be strongly influenced by these heating patterns, and there may be some effects of global climate change, which we'll need to consider when we get there. So those are the great circulating patterns. And remember, what these huge ocean currents are doing, they're acting as heat pumps. The movement of the water, as it goes, it tends to move warm water away from the equatorial regions, introducing a bit of cooling, and it tends to move that heat towards the higher latitudes, introducing heating to the higher latitudes. It's like the global air conditioning system, except in its water. So these systems are, over a long period of time, are really very stable. And because both the water, the ocean waters, and the air currents above them influence the climate of the land that they are near or that they pass over, they tend to establish relatively stable climate systems in the terrestrial habitats that they influence. And because there are these relatively stable climate patterns, we see that these areas develop, first of all, a typical kind of vegetation. Now, it is a remarkable thing that the vegetation tends to share characteristics, even if the species differ. I'll mention specific instance in a while. But the vegetation tends to share characteristics. So, for example, we may have areas which are strongly influenced by the fact that they are high pressure areas where only dry air impacts on them. Let's just go back here for a minute. Sorry, thither. No. All right, I'll use this diagram. I thought I had another, but okay. So remember, here the air is rising, here dropping lots of moisture. So in this area here, this is where we find the rainforests. Same here, same situation pertains here. Rising air, dropping lots of moisture as rainfall. And this is where the rainforests are here. Rainforests are characterized by high rainfall, high temperatures. So they occur at the low latitudes. But look up here. Here's where the air rises here. It diverges and it falls here because it is dry. It has no moisture left in it. And it is relatively cool. Falls to the earth here in a high pressure area. And this is desert. And the deserts tend to be north and south of these high rainfall areas here. And that is a relatively stable pattern all around the globe. And it arises because of these circulation cells. And these tend to produce relatively stable high areas with low rainfall, typical of a desert. And these tend to produce areas of low atmospheric pressure, high rainfall, high temperature. So these relatively stable vegetation, climatic areas, we call a biome. And there are numerous characteristic biomes all over the planet. How many biomes there are actually depends who you're talking to. But there's generally recognized that there are 8 to 9 great biomes. And then some people consider various other areas of the planet to be separate biomes, as many as 11 or 12, whatever. The biome is characterized by a particular climate regime, by vegetation which shows particular characteristics. And then associated with that, of course, there would be a fauna. There will be animals associated with that, with those areas. And the animals tend to adapt over time through evolution to the conditions that they have around them. So there's a little a video for you to watch here as well. It's not in your exercises, so if you want to, I'm not going to say if you want to watch it, I want you to watch it from this link here. So as we look around the planet, here's what we see. We see the repetition around the globe of these biome types. Here are our rainforests, our tropical rainforests, all spread here around the equatorial regions. Here are the great deserts, north and south. South America tends to be a bit difficult to see, but here and here and here are desert areas in South America, Australia, Africa, and the Middle East. High up latitudes, we tend here in the northern hemisphere, we have areas of coniferous forest. Then even higher, we have tundra areas, which I'll describe in a minute, and then onto the polar regions there. So these biome types, these biomes are major ecosystems, and they are defined by distinctive vegetation type. And I emphasize this, it is a type. It is not particular species. You may have very, very different species of plant, for example, in this tropical rainforest here than you do here, and certainly than you have here. But they have certain characteristics in which they are very, very similar. Similar for the desert areas. The desert areas have vastly different vegetation in terms of species, but they tend to share characteristics. For example, desert areas, if they have their plants, are resistant to being dried out. They are resistant to desiccation. They tend to store water in some form or another. They are very often they are succulent. They have water-filled leaves or water-filled stems or water-filled tubers in the ground, something like that. So here are some of the major biome types that you need to think about. And here is a link which will discuss in more detail in written form. the characteristics of the biomes, and you may want to make a note and come back, or even download and print this link, the material that this link takes you to, because this will be useful to you in answering some of the questions posed to you during the assignments. So here are some of the great major biomes. First of all, tropical rainforest, which is probably familiar to all of you from TV and everything else. These desert areas, these are almost in contrast to one another. High rainfall. Remember, these are low pressure areas. These are warm areas, but with high rainfall. Deserts, you need to be careful. Deserts are not necessarily all hot. We tend to think of them as being hot. But the thing that characterizes a desert actually is low rainfall, a low precipitation. That is its good. And there are cold deserts or temperate deserts in the world. They are deserts don't necessarily have to be hot places. But this is actually Namib Desert in Africa, in southern Africa, which is very certainly a hot desert. Savanna is open areas with many grasses and only occasional trees. Typical savannas occur in Africa and South America. Grasslands tend to be higher latitude than equatorial regions, but we would have typical grasslands in the Midwest of the United States, but they also occur in Africa, Australia, various other places as well. Deciduous forests, well, that's typical for our latitude, and those are, under normal circumstances, we would be surrounded by deciduous forests. But of course, human interference has resulted in us having very few. If you are interested, in New York, the closest that you would get to the natural deciduous forest, even though it has been changed, is in Prospect Park. Prospect Park preserved the last remaining forest of Brooklyn, and that would be a typical deciduous forest. Chaparral is a very interesting biome type, and chaparral, the kind of most typical, the most famous area of chaparral is actually in the Mediterranean, and chaparral is often referred to as the Mediterranean biome. The Mediterranean area characteristically has a long, dry summer and a very wet, cold winter. And that is typical of Mediterranean chaparral areas all around the world. And the major chaparral areas are Mediterranean, as I've mentioned, California. This is actually Californian chaparral, and South Africa and Australia. Those are the major chaparral areas. And there's one other character I just mentioned to you. The chaparral areas are all adapted to fire because they have a very long, dry summer, and they tend to dry out, to desiccate, and become very susceptible to fire. And all of the vegetation is in fact adapted to occasional fire. Coniferous forests, that should be familiar to you. Coniferous forests tend to be higher latitudes than the deciduous forest, but we also do have mixed deciduous and coniferous forests in certain areas. Tundra, that is, these are areas, high latitudes with predominantly frozen ground. So they have permafrost. And then finally, the polar regions with polar ice. In fact, polar regions are deserts. The Antarctica, for example, receives less precipitation in a year than the Sahara Desert. So it really is, I told you, we define deserts by their precipitation. Polar ice really is a desert form. So in any case, have a look at the links to get more information about the different biome types. And remember that these all have their, of course, depending where they are, have their own associated fauna as well. So there are also aquatic biomes, but they are rather more difficult to define because, of course, they don't have climate in the same way the terrestrial regions do. However, we do recognize different aquatic biomes, the most important division being between marine and freshwater. And we recognize aquatic biomes by those which have characteristic faunal types, but also whether they're cold water, warm water regimes, and also they're strongly regulated by depth. So these are the major influences on aquatic biomes. First of all, the degree, how salty they are, marine, freshwater. Second of all, they are affected by water temperature. And they're very strongly influenced by depth, because the deeper you go, the less sunlight can reach. So the primary production in aquatic biomes is limited, and it is limited to those areas which are shallow enough to receive sufficient light. So just to introduce you to the idea that there are, in fact, these aquatic biomes. We do marine first. And this is one of the most important. These are the intertidal areas, and those you've already heard about in the keystone exercises and everything that you did for module 2. Sandy beaches, coral reefs, that should be familiar to you, at least, from TV and everything else, if you haven't yourself seen them. Coral reefs are one of the most fascinating of all the marine biomes. And just to give you one interesting fact about them, the corals are limited by light. And the reason for that is that they have photosynthetic organisms which live inside them. We say as a symbiotic relationship. And the corals do not thrive if they are not in a particular light regime. So coral reefs are limited by light, just as other primary producers would be, even though the corals are animals. Then one that you may not have heard about, even in the very deepest ocean areas, there are distinct ecosystems that occur. And one of the biomes which is recognized in the deep ocean are deep sea volcanic vents. These are areas where hot water pours out of vents in the sea floor, and there's huge communities of animals, which huge in terms of the species number and everything, which are associated with those in very, very complex relationships, but very distinctive systems which depend upon the chemicals which these volcanic vents pump out. So aquatic biomes, I'm going to put a bit of emphasis on, because in a later module, we are going to be talking about fresh water and our use of fresh water. The aquatic biomes, the freshwater aquatic biomes, lakes and ponds, that's familiar to you, rivers, and then wetlands. Now, wetlands are areas which are strongly influenced by the water that's in them, but they have soils which tend to be saturated. And these are extremely important areas. Unfortunately, they're also areas which are terribly abused by human beings. We love to drain them, farm on them, build holiday homes on them, etc., etc. And it's only in recent years, in the last 50 years or so, that the really critical importance of these wetland areas has become apparent, because they, first of all, they are very, very productive areas. They have a lot of production of fish and all sorts of things associated with them. But also they are great filters. They tend to filter out material that's flowing from the land towards the sea or towards other bodies of water. They act as settlement areas, but they also act as very important buffers. So, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, the loss of wetlands in the Gulf of Mexico has strongly influenced the impact of hurricanes on human settlements, because formerly the wetlands acted as a buffer between ocean water action, high waves, etc., and the land. So that we will talk a little bit more about wetlands later on in another module. Okay, and just introduce you to the idea of why we are so interested in fresh water. Of course, we are absolutely dependent on it. And a very small portion of all of the water on the planet is actually usable by human beings. Only about 1% of the water. Most of it is seawater, of course, unusable as it is. In seawater can, of course, be desalinated, but at enormous expense. Under natural circumstances, only about 1% is usable. And when we look at its distribution, it's very interesting, because in fact, 99% of the water, of the fresh water, is actually underground. And only 1% is up on the surface. The bulk of that in lakes and also frozen into glaciers. But the groundwater is our most important freshwater resource. And that is very unfortunate, because we have abused our groundwater reserves terribly. It is being overused, pumped out faster, far, far faster from the ground than it can be replaced by rainfall, by natural rainfall and percolation, etc. But also because we have used groundwater as a dumping ground. We have pumped waste, for example, waste products into the underground aquifers, thinking that it would simply disappear, when it doesn't. What it does is it actually pollutes the groundwater. And so there is a very, very strong impetus to actually start conserving and preserving groundwaters, because their loss, if we lose groundwater, they are replaced very, very slowly over a period of centuries. We extract water so fast that it simply can't be replaced. Okay, so I just very briefly going to introduce you to, we've talked about biomes. Biomes are defined by their climate and by their living characteristics, by their biotic characteristics. I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to the idea of anthromes. Well, anthromes are ecological patterns which are created by sustained human impact, human interactions with ecosystems. And as consider, for example, I have already suggested to you, Brooklyn was once covered by a vast forest. And so, in fact, it was Manhattan. It was also forested, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it. And we have to ask ourselves, where did that go? And what did we replace it with? Well, in the case of towns and cities, we regard these as being a particular kind of anthrome, and that is dense settlement. And this is in areas where there is high population density and intensive land use, and the land use is not for farming or production of food or anything like that. The land use is occupied largely by residents and industrial complex. And these dense settlements are, of course, associated with high emissions, and the most important ones being carbon emissions and also nitrogen emissions. We'll talk about the importance of nitrogen air pollution in another module. And the biodiversity is very low. Most of the natural biodiversity has simply been eradicated or displaced. And instead, most of the biodiversity comes to rely on islands, which are natural, or not necessarily natural, but islands of cultivation. So for parks and recreation areas, gardens, those sort of things. And what indigenous flora and fauna remain have to try and make their living out of these small spaces compared to the very large spaces that were there before. Contrast that with villages. Villages are areas of human population, small towns, small cities, and they tend to be very closely associated with agriculture, a lot of which is intensive, but provides for the inhabitants of that area. So the members of a village or small town having their own food production, for example, and they may expand that to disposing of the excess of food, but usually they are characterized by concentrating on providing for themselves, not for commercial purpose. Croplands are those areas familiar to any of you from the Midwest, or anywhere like that. They are intensively cultivated lands with very low human population density. There are areas where biodiversity has almost been eradicated and instead favors monoculture, that is, growing of one species in large blocks. They may, an individual farm may grow several things, but they tend to grow them in very large monocultures that are adjacent to one another. Rangelands are a little bit different. These are areas which are wilder, and they are used for livestock grazing. They tend to have low human population density, and although they may have important town areas of higher density, but they are very strongly impacted by the grazing. They are areas where, in fact, the biome has been substantially altered simply by the fact that it is having to support much higher herbivore populations in the form of cattle than it normally would. And the herbivore population tends to be monospecific. It tends to be of one species only, where under normal circumstances there would be far fewer, but higher, there would be higher species diversity. Then we move to semi-natural areas. Well, they are areas with low levels of human use, less than 20% or so. And they are areas which tend to be more, they retain their natural character despite the fact that there is human occupation there at a certain level. And wildlands or wilderness are areas without any resident human population or agriculture. And these areas which we can regard as being completely natural, but we need to remember that they are still subject to human influence. And we will talk, for example, about the impact in these wildlands of invasive species, for example, and the changes that they can cause in these areas. And above all, of course, these are all areas, all of these areas are influenced by global climate change, which is impacting everything on the planet, impacting the functioning of the entire biosphere. Okay, so this moves you on to your exercises and assignments for the week. And these are further investigations, both of climate and then of the biome, different biomes. And you're going to be using this, I don't know if it'll take me there. No, it won't. You're going to be using a link to a marvelous application called the Biome Viewer. And you are perfectly welcome to fool around with it and just ask yourself some questions about it. And then I have given you a worksheet, which I'm asking you to complete. On the worksheet, it is a writable PDF, and there are alternatives. There are some places that you will actually type in your answer. Other places, there are check boxes for you to complete. It's writable and editable, but then when you're done, you're sure you save it, and then you upload it to the assignment page. You will see there, as you did for the previous module, you'll see a link there to upload your worksheet. Okay, so I wish you all good luck with that, and I will be recording another lesson for you next week.